Were you taught everything you should have been taught in Intro Psych? Let's find out. Hello there, this is Bradley, and you're listening to Psych Everywhere, a podcast by PsychI, the International Honor Society in Psychology. For this show, distinguished guests weigh in on applying psychological science to a diverse range of current events and to better your life. Listen for free wherever you go for podcasts, or see the link in the show note for a written transcript of this episode. This episode was made possible through a PsychI sponsorship with the Alliant International University, California School of Professional Psychology. If you'd like to learn about graduate programs at CSPP, be sure to check out the link in the show notes for this episode. If you're a faculty member, this episode will give you ideas for revamping your Intro Psych course. Or, if you're a student or an alumni member, this episode will open your eyes to topics that might not have been included in your Intro Psych course, but that probably should have been. With me today to discuss Intro Psych curriculum is Sue Frantz, who gave 2 APS presentations this year related to today's topic, one of which she gave as the PsychI Distinguished Lecturer at that convention. Sue earned a master's in social psychology at the University of Kansas. Combined, she has over 30 years of experience teaching at New Mexico State University, Alamogordo, and later at Highline College in Washington, where she is now faculty emerita. More recently, Sue returned to New Mexico, where she's now an affiliate faculty member at New Mexico State University, Las Cruces. Relevant to today's topic of revamping psychology education, Sue was on the executive committee for the Society for the Teaching of Psychology for 8 years, and she's a co-author on several notable books, including Introduction to Psychology, Principles of Social Psychology, and Teaching Psychology, a step-by-step guide. Another impressive accomplishment, in 2016, she received APA's prestigious Charles L. Brewer Distinguished Teaching of Psychology Award. Sue, welcome to Psych Everywhere.
Thanks, Bradley. Thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to this.
I think this topic will be fun because it's a little different for us. So usually we talk about how psychology is everywhere, even in the last place that you'd think to look. So this episode kind of turns that on its head in some ways, because we're going to talk about how some important psychology lessons actually aren't in one of the first places that you'd think to look, which is your Intro Psych course. I think I had more fun saying that sentence than listeners will unraveling it, but anyway, so I'll just jump into this first question. Why do you believe that it's important for faculty to revise the content in the Intro Psych courses?
You know, historically, I think a lot of psychology faculty have really dismissed the Intro Psych course. They haven't seen it as important as what it is. Probably, we're guessing, about 1.5 million students take Intro Psych annually at the college level in the United States. And the vast majority of those students, meaning 90 to 95% of those students, are not psychology majors. So I really got to thinking, as many, many years have gone by and I've taught this course, about who really is the audience for this course. And so many instructors teach it as though the primary audience is the psychology major. Now, I love the psychology majors. I was one, big fan of psychology majors. But even most psychology majors don't go on to graduate school in psychology. They're going on into business and healthcare and law enforcement and politics. And so even for our psychology majors, what is it that they really need to take away from the intro course? And for all of those students who are majoring in something else, what is it that they really need to know? And I really came to this in thinking about my neighbors. Where I lived in the Seattle area, I had a lot of neighbors who had college degrees. They had bachelor's degrees in something. And education, aeronautical engineering, computer programming. So many people have college degrees, and we know that because Intro Psych is such a popular course, chances were pretty good that they had taken this class, Intro Psych. So what is it, I thought, that my neighbors really needed to know about psychology? And some of the content that's in the course traditionally is absolutely appropriate, and some of it's not. And there's some really important stuff that we should be covering in that course that we're just not doing.
When reimagining intro psych curriculum, how do you determine which topics should be included and how might others further explore potential course changes?
For me, the place to start is as going through the course to think about, do my neighbors really need to know this? You know, when I was invited to join this Intro Psych textbook as the junior author, I really had to spend some time thinking about this because it's one thing to do it in my own course. What do my neighbors need to know? But to put it in writing that so many faculty are going to read and so many students are going to read, I had to really put some serious consideration into it. So everything that I write goes through my wife. She's my in-house editor. She's an excellent writer. So as she was reading my chapter revisions for this book, she would write in the margins. I remember 2 distinct incidents where she wrote in the margins, do our neighbors need to know this? And in one particular case, she was right. Our neighbors did not need to know it. It was in the biopsych chapter. I'm afraid I don't remember now what it was. It was something that was really fascinating to me, but no, not crucially important. So I deleted it. The second time, again, I don't remember what it was. Our neighbors did need to know it, but if she wasn't able to pick it up from what I had written, I needed to rewrite it. And I did. And she read it and she's like, oh, okay, now I get it. Sure, our neighbors need to know that. And even now, she'll hear something in the news and she'll send it to me. And she said, I think our neighbors need to know this. So totally keeping me to my word. So for faculty, I would really encourage you, as you teach the course, to think about why you are teaching this particular thing. Is it something that everybody needs to know? Or are you kind of teaching it by default because you've always taught it or because it's in your textbook? So for faculty, I encourage you to ask your students. And I just had an email exchange with a faculty member who is doing exactly that, asking her students, okay, what in this particular chapter was really important for you to know and why?
Well, let's get into some examples of information that you think should be included. Could you tell us a little about, there's a woman you discussed at your APS talk who redesigned the kitchens and contributed to the Apollo space program. And then why do you think that her contribution should be included?
Yeah. Lillian Gilbreth. Holy cow. We need to bring her back into the Intro Psych curriculum. So for many years, I had been talking at conferences with faculty about how we need to rethink the history that we teach in Intro Psych. Students come into Intro Psych often very excited about the course. And the very first thing that we often give them is the history, starting with the Greek philosophers. And it just squeezes all the fun out of psychology. So when I joined this Intro Psych textbook, it had the traditional history. So I asked some friends of mine who know a lot about the history of psychology, Ken Keith, Linda Wolf, Barney Bynes, and I asked them, who in the history of psychology do your neighbors need to know about? And they were pretty much in agreement on a few different people, including Lillian Gilbreth. Now, I didn't know very much about Lillian Gilbreth. I knew a little bit, but not very much. So I hop on the internet and wow, just the stuff that she did. You know, a lot of people don't know this, Bradley, but only one PhD psychologist in the United States has ever been on a postage stamp, and that is Lillian Gilbreth. And that tells you a little bit about how well-known and well-respected she was in her time, and we have virtually forgotten her. I don't know how many times I've presented at a conference now where I've put up a photo of Lillian Gilbreth, and virtually nobody knows her or recognizes her name. But by the time I'm done, yeah, they definitely know who she is. So after this by the end of this podcast, people definitely know who Lillian Gilbreth is. Some people might recognize her as the woman from Cheaper by the Dozen. It was a young person's book, and then later a movie. Lillian was not crazy about either of those ways that she was portrayed because she was really pushed into the background, and it didn't really touch on what she accomplished, which was really pretty phenomenal. Well, Lillian was ready to go off to college in 1899, 1900, something like that. And her father said absolutely not, because what does a woman need with a college education? And she wore him down, and she eventually did go to Berkeley and earn her bachelor's, I think, in English. Well, for her master's degree, which was also going to be in English, she heads off to Columbia in New York City. She was born in Oakland, goes entirely across the country. Why did she go entirely across the country? Probably to get some distance between her and her family. Well, unfortunately, she gets really sick. She has to come back to Oakland, and she ends up earning a master's, I think, in English from Berkeley. Meanwhile, she meets this guy, Frank Gilbreth. He's from Boston. He has his own construction company, and they get married. Well, Frank was really interested in finding the one best way to do something. Mm-hmm. So as he's watching his construction workers laying bricks, for example, he notices that they seem to be doing it pretty inefficiently. So he and Lillian work together, and they use this newfangled technology called film. And they record people as they're doing their jobs. And they break down every movement. What is the right hand doing? What's the left hand doing? How long are they doing these movements? How long are they lifting something, grasping something? And they do this deep analysis. And this becomes known as scientific management. They were not the only folks who were doing this. There was another guy who was doing it, who had his own cult following. But Lillian and Frank were the only ones who were using film. So they're recording, and they find some ways to make the work much more efficient. And they become very well known for this and very well respected, and they're being contracted by all kinds of people. For example, a hospital contacted them and said, okay, our surgeries are taking too long. The anesthetic that was popular at the time in the early 1900s was ether, and it's not a great anesthetic. And the longer somebody was under, the worse the outcomes for them. So they're trying to speed things up. So the Gilbreths go in and they analyze what's happening in the operating room. And, we don't even think about it now. But at the time, the surgeon's tool tray was not organized in any way. All the tools are just kind of stacked on there. And it was the surgeon who would have to look away from what they were doing to the tool tray, find what they needed, and then turn back. And this was taking a lot of time. So the Gilbreth said, here's an idea. How about the tool tray have a standard layout for each particular kind of surgery, so you know exactly where the tools are? And do you one better? Let's have somebody else be in charge of those tools, so the surgeon doesn't have to look away from what they're doing. They can just ask, give me the scalpel. And then somebody else puts the scalpel in their hand. So this is exactly how surgery is done today, but it was the Gilbreths who did that. So they become really well known for doing this kind of job analysis, work analysis. And then in 1924, they now have 11 children. One, unfortunately, died from diphtheria at the age of 5. So they've got 11 children. 1924, Frank dies suddenly from a heart attack. It's now all Lillian. And within the year, her 3 biggest corporate contracts evaporated because of sexism. They said, what does a woman know about business? Well, Lillian, by this time, she's got a PhD in applied psychology from Brown University. And the reason she went and got this PhD was because she wanted to have some credibility. And for some companies, that didn't mean anything. It was her gender that trumped everything else. So she then has to recreate herself. And she does that. She does a whole bunch of things, including what you had mentioned, redesigning our kitchens. She got employed by a contracted gas company that had these brand new fangled kitchen appliances that were gas appliances. And so they invited her to come in and figure out what the design of these gas appliances should be. Eventually, she goes to do some contract work with General Electric, GE, which was a major appliance manufacturer in the early part of the 20th century, just as they are now. And by observing thousands of women, and it was women, working in the kitchen, she determined a whole bunch of things. She determined the optimal height for the stove, for example. What she really wanted was a fully adjustable stove. She was really an early developer of, I guess you can call her the mother of ergonomics. Because she said, some women are shorter, the stove should be shorter. Some women are taller, the stove should be taller. And GE said, yeah, we're not going to do that. We can't have completely adjustable stoves. And then she said, well, can we do a compromise? Can we have short, medium, and high stoves? And they said, yeah, no, we're not doing that either. So therefore, she determined, okay, well, this is average height. So, okay, we'll go with this. Before Lillian got a hold of our kitchens, everything was standalone furniture. The idea that you have this level countertop that goes in an L shape was completely foreign. So she's the one who gave us level countertops. She's the one who gave us countertops, frankly. Level countertops. Wow. She's the one who determined that the L shape was the optimal for working in the kitchen. She's the one who determined that the triangular placement of fridge, sink, stove was the most efficient route, and that the perimeter, if you measure that triangle, the perimeter, she said, should be no more than 26 feet for optimal kitchen efficiency. So, of course, the first thing I do is run to our kitchen, grab the tape measure, and our kitchen triangle perimeter is 21 feet. So she does other things with our kitchen. She's the one who gave us shelving in our refrigerator doors. Before Lillian, there were no shelves in the doors, and she did that solely because of efficiency. Now you don't have to dig around in the back to find the ketchup. It's just right there. If your fridge has a butter compartment, that was Lillian Gilbreth. Some of you might remember the old refrigerators that had egg compartments in the doors, and that was Lillian Gilbreth. That made a lot more sense when you had chickens out back, where you were collecting your own eggs. Makes me wonder, now that so many people I know anyway are getting chickens for their eggs, if that is going to come back. And the pedal trash can is attributed to Lillian Gilbreth. So if you've got a trash can where you press on a pedal and the lid comes up, that was all done in the name of efficiency. It had nothing to do with, right? I'm actually on a mission to get that called the Gilbreth. So yeah, if you got a pedal trash can, please start calling it the Gilbreth. And then you have people over and like, Gilbreth, what are you talking about? Well, let me tell you about Lillian Gilbreth. Neighbors, you need to know this. So she transformed our lives in just so many, many ways. If your oven and your stovetop are two separate things, there's some evidence that Lillian may have been the first to suggest doing that you don't have to have one entire unit. There's no reason why they can't be separate. And if you do have separate units, that oven may be up higher, which is going to be easier to pull stuff in and out of. And you can see the ergonomic advantage of that. So the Apollo engineers, when they were designing the Apollo space capsule, they used the Gilbreth methods as they analyzed how the astronauts would be able to use the instruments in the cockpit of the Apollo spacecraft. So every time you walk into your kitchen now, I want you to think about Lillian Gilbreth and how psychology completely transformed your home life.
This episode was made possible through a Psych sponsorship with the Alliant International University, California School of Professional Psychology. That's CSPP. Founded in 1969, CSPP was one of the nation's first independent schools of professional psychology. Today, CSPP continues its commitment to preparing the next generation of mental health professionals and advocates. Their dedication to ensuring every community's access to quality mental health care extends from integrated care to inclusive family therapy. Explore their programs at https://info.alliant.edu/partner-psychi. And of course, I'll put a link in the show notes for that as well. I will do so. That's awesome. And I've been with Psychi for a little over 10 years now. And throughout all the articles that I've read, I don't recall ever hearing her name, which is wild considering how much that she's done. Your APS talk also spotlighted two other psychologists, and their research played a pivotal role in civil rights history. Could you share a little about that as well?
Yeah, so when I asked my friends who should be in the history section of Intro Psych, in addition to Lillian Gilbreth, they were all in agreement that we should include Kenneth and Mamie Phipps Clark. Now, I had some familiarity with the Clarks, not enough. What I knew about the Clarks was the doll study. I had no idea that the doll study played a pivotal role in the Supreme Court decision in Brown versus Board of Education. How do I not know that? How do you not know that? Did you know that?
I didn't know that until recently, within the last couple of years, because we've have a Mamie Phipps Clark Award that Psychi offers in her name, but I hadn't heard that part of it until recently.
Yeah, so let's fix that. So let me see how much of the story I want to tell you, because it's quite the story. Personally, I think that there should be a biopic or a documentary on the Clarks. Their story is just so fascinating, way beyond the doll study. So the doll study was actually conducted by Mamie. It was her thing. And Kenneth, in later years, in interviews after they become famous for this, he made it very clear that it was her study. And as he said, he just kind of, quote unquote, piggybacked on it. So Mamie was really interested in child development, and they met as students at Howard University. Mamie was an undergrad. Kenneth was a graduate student working on a master's in political science. So when she finishes college, they get married. Kenneth goes off to Columbia to earn a PhD, and he is the only Black person in the department and the first Black person to earn a PhD from Columbia. Meanwhile, Mamie finishes her master's at Howard, and she goes on to Columbia, double checking to make sure I had that right. So Mamie goes on to Columbia to earn her PhD. She is also the only Black person in the department because Kenneth has since graduated. Mamie becomes the first Black woman to earn a PhD in psychology from Columbia. Now, who is Mamie working with at Columbia? She chose to work with a guy named Henry Garrett. Henry Garrett was a big-time racist, like all capital letters, boldface. Yeah, big-time racist. He later becomes, just a couple years after Mamie graduates, he becomes president of APA. And here's a little side note. The year after Henry Garrett was president of APA, Carl Rogers was president. So Henry Garrett, he was part of a group that sent out a pamphlet to hundreds of thousands of high school teachers around the country, explaining how if people who are Black and people who are white got together, that they would have less intelligent children. And so that just couldn't happen. So this guy was no joke on the racism front. So the question is, why does Mamie choose to work with him? Nobody knows. One of her biographers says that she liked the challenge. His views were probably known in the department, but they didn't become super public until after she had graduated. So she probably knew that he at least had racist leanings, if not knowing to the extent that he actually did. That's one possibility. Another possibility is she knew it full well and decided that she was going to try to change his views just by her being her. Another possibility is that he knew stuff and like legitimate psychological research methods, and she specifically wanted to work with him for that knowledge. Any case, she works with him, she earns her PhD, and when she leaves Columbia, she has a series of, sucky research jobs. She hated them. So after these research jobs, she went to work for the Riverdale Home for Children. And it's in New York City, and it served a bunch of kids. And what she's noticing is that the services that were available to Black children weren't quite up to par for the services that were available to white children. So she starts talking with local social service agencies, encouraging them to do something about this, and it's falling on deaf ears. So she does the only thing that's reasonable, and she and Kenneth start their own facility called the Northside Center for Child Development, which she ran until she retired from there in 1979. They opened that in 1946. But by this point, Kenneth is faculty at City College of New York. Mamie is running the Northside Center. And as a little side note, the Northside Center is still in operation. And last year they had an annual budget of $24 million. So absolutely had a lasting impact on kids in New York City. So she brings all kinds of psychological testing is what she's doing, in addition to parenting classes and stuff like that at the Northside Center. And one way that they became really well known in the local community is that a lot of the Black children were attending these schools and were being labeled as inferior in some way and being put into remedial classes. And she put out word in the local community, bring your kids here for psychological testing. Let's find out if that's really where they need to be. And the testing showed, no, that is not where they needed to be. So the Northside Center becomes well-known and well-respected. All right, let's back up in time. So Mamie is working on her master's degree at Howard, and Kenneth, her husband, meets this guy in New York City. And Eugene Hartley, who was actually born Eugene Horowitz, he changed his name because of anti-Semitism. He and his wife, who was also a psychologist, were doing some work on child development and how children develop their identity. And he was discovering some interesting things about Black children not seeming to identify as Black. But he has a very small sample, and he's not sure what to make of this. So he's telling Kenneth about this, and Kenneth goes to Mamie and says, you got to meet this guy because he's doing some work that I think you'll be interested in. So Mamie meets Eugene, and they talk, and Eugene says, okay, you have access to a whole bunch of young Black children at a daycare center, an all-Black daycare center in the Washington, D.C. area. So how about you take this on as your master's project? So she does. It was kind of for an initial study, it wasn't bad. So what she was doing is she was taking these line drawings that Hartley had used in his study. It was a line drawing of a young Black boy. And she showed that drawing to Black boys and Black girls. So she showed him a line drawing of a Black boy, a line drawing of a white boy, and a line drawing of something irrelevant. And the irrelevant included a picture of a lion, a hen, a dog, a clown, and asked the kids, which one is you? And as the father of a 3-year-old, Bradley, I don't think you'll be surprised to hear that almost 20% of the kids identified as the clown, the hen, the dog, something irrelevant. As the kids, by the time they're 4 years old, though, they're not doing that. So for the 3-year-olds, a third of them identified as the Black boy. At 4 years old, 60% identified as the Black boy. And at 5 years old, 63% identified as the black boy. So for 4 and 5-year-olds, a third to 40% are identifying as the white boy. And so Mamie is really wondering, what's the story here? Now, I mentioned that she also showed these drawings to girls, to black girls. And the question for them, though, was a little different because she only had line drawings for boys. So what she asked the girls was to think about a young child in your life, a brother, a boy child in your life, a brother, a cousin, and how would they identify? Well, we of course know that's a very different question to get into somebody else's head and figure out how they would identify. So I don't think too much about that data, and I suspect that Mamie questioned that later. So her next study is what became known as the doll study. So this time, she actually takes a baby doll, 2 baby dolls, a white one and a black one, and this is 1940s. There were no black baby dolls. So they had to take a white baby doll and paint it black. So they show the baby dolls that are gender neutral to black children and ask them, well, she actually had a bunch of questions for them that includes, give me the doll that you like to play with, the one that's the nice doll, the one that looks bad, the one that's a nice color. And about 2/3 of the kids are saying the white one is the nice one, the one I want to play with. And then she asked them, so give me the doll that looks like a white child, the one that looks like a black child. And they have no problem doing that. At the 94% are getting that right. And then they asked the most difficult question. Give me the doll that looks like you. So at this point, we've got 2/3 of the kids saying the white one is the good one. They then say, yep, that other one, that's the black one. And now they're asked, which one looks like you? You can imagine the dissonance. And Kenneth, who observed this, said in later interviews that this was incredibly heart-wrenching to watch. 2 kids refused to answer the question. They left the room in tears. So give me the doll that looks like you. A third of the kids chose the white one. They just could not say, I'm the black one. Kenneth said in a later interview that one of the children spontaneously offered, I'm really white. I just got a really, really dark tan over the summer. So here are so many kids, very young children, who are saying, yeah, I'm not going to identify as black. So by the time we get to Brown versus Board of Education, which is a whole story unto itself, this research is incredibly important. When it was presented in the cases leading up, there were 5 cases actually that became part of the Brown versus Board of Education decision. As these cases are going through the courts, Kenneth was asked to testify about the doll study in 3 of those cases. And why Kenneth and not Mamie? Well, because he's a guy. So as a black man standing in front of all white courts and judges, he was already fighting an uphill battle. So to put a woman in that position too would have been more difficult even. So we live with the sexism. Interestingly, however, there was one of those 5 cases where Mamie was asked to testify. And I suspect the reason she was asked to testify is because her advisor from graduate school, Henry Garrett, was asked to testify for the other side. So he presents his racist views as science, and Kenneth already testified about the doll study, so that's not Mamie's job. Mamie's job, I suspect, was to just be there and be Mamie and to say, yeah, here's a black woman who worked under him. How much credibility does this guy really have? So we all know the outcome, that the doll study played a pivotal role in Brown versus Board of Education, overturning segregation laws in the U.S. So we know it had an impact because when the Supreme Court Chief Justice Earl Warren wrote the unanimous opinion of the court, he mentioned specifically the outcome of that doll study. So they changed the course of history, not just in doing that study, but also being willing to put themselves out there and testify in front of some pretty intimidating courts.
Could you share any other examples of information that you think should be included in the course? And then we'll get on to the juicier bit of what do we think should be taken out.
Oh, yay. Well, if you haven't heard of hero rats, do a Google search on hero rats. I believe that everybody, all of our neighbors, should know who the hero rats are. There's a guy who is a big rodent lover, and he was really concerned about unexploded landmines in war-torn areas. Armies go in, they drop landmines, they leave, but they don't take the landmines with them. So here's the local population. All they want to do is farm the land, and instead they're being blown up by these landmines. So there are some organizations that will go in and work to clear out the landmines. Well, to have people go in and do it with a metal detector, it's very dangerous work and very slow work. And this guy said, well, why can't we train rats? They've got a great sense of smell. Can they smell the ordnance? Turns out they can, and they are too light at 2 pounds. They used the giant African pouched rat. At 2 pounds, they're too light to set off the landmines, but they have no problem sniffing them out. So they've been fantastic at that and clearing land much quicker than humans can with metal detectors. They're also now being used to detect tuberculosis in sputum samples. For a human to do the biological testing of these sputum samples for tuberculosis, it's very time consuming. These rats give it one sniff, yes or no, and on they go. And they have become incredibly efficient at that. Now they're being trained to go into rubble, like earthquake rubble, to look for survivors. And the advantage that the rats have over robots is that with the robots, if they lose contact with the surface, they're dead in the water. Humans put little backpacks on the rats, and the little backpacks have a video camera and mic, speakers, and the rats go looking for survivors. And if they lose contact with the surface, they just turn around and go back to the surface. And all of these rats are working for banana mash or avocado mash. They are treated really, really well. They work for, I think, no more than 20 minutes at a time, and they live in a communal environment. So yeah, absolutely. We need to know about hero rats. What else? The therapy chapter in a traditional Intro Psych class. Okay, we do absolutely need to know about the different kinds of therapy, by all means. But so many of our therapy chapters really get into the history of these psychotherapeutic techniques. That's probably not all that necessary, especially since there's other stuff we should be covering, like the different kinds of practitioners. Clinical social workers, counseling psychologists, clinical psychologists, psychiatrists, mental health nurse practitioners, prescribing psychologists. You know, when I sat down to sort this out, it took me a long time to figure out who is doing what. And I know something, and it's taking me some effort to figure this out. Well, imagine what it's like for our neighbors. Yeah, they decide I could use a little therapy. I could use some help. Well, where do they start? How to find a psychotherapist or other mental health practitioner. We don't talk about that in intro. What happens in the first psychotherapy session? A lot of people are really hesitant. That's just incredibly scary to them. So we should be talking about that. And what questions should you be asking that person? Just because you make an appointment with them doesn't mean that you're all in with them. That there are some questions that should be asked. We need to talk about the importance of sleep. A lot of people already cover that when they teach Intro Psych. But when we talk about how to get good sleep, we often put it on the individual. These are the things that you should be doing to get better sleep. That you should have a quiet environment, a dark environment. You should turn off the screens. You should have a set bedtime and a set wake time all the time. And that sounds great. Nothing wrong with that. But if you live in the inner city, for example, You probably have much more ambient light. You've got much more ambient noise. You may be working nights. We know that Black and Hispanic workers are much more likely to work the overnight night shift than our white workers. And we know that trying to sleep during the day is really hard. Acculturation stress. If you're a recent immigrant, for example, and you're trying to figure out just how grocery stores work, that stress is going to interfere with your sleep. So we should be talking about that. We probably should be talking more about ways of managing stress. We should be talking about grief. A lot of people in Intro don't cover the emotions chapter because oftentimes the emotion chapter isn't talking about the important stuff we need to know, like emotion regulation. How is it that we can gain better control over our emotions in the various situations that we experience? And we need to be talking about gender and how so much of our experience of gender is actually on a continuum, and that it's not just male, female, and that is it. So those are some examples of things that we should absolutely be covering. But you also want to talk about things that we can take out.
Yes, I have my foot right now on the Gilbreth pedal, and I'm ready to unload things that I don't need.
So one way to think about this for instructors is our time with our students is finite. And for everything that we are choosing to cover, we are choosing not to cover something else. So if we're teaching something by default, what is it now that we don't have time to cover? So we just can't keep adding stuff. And that's kind of how a lot of textbooks have gotten to be encyclopedic. When you look at some of the best-selling Intro Psych textbooks, they are encyclopedic. Stuff goes in and it doesn't come out. So what I'm suggesting is that we need to be more thoughtful about what it is that we are covering. So I've just said, okay, here's a whole bunch of stuff that we should add. For example, in the personality chapter is a lot of history. And the personality researchers have made this pretty clear. Please get rid of the history. Like, if you want to talk about it, fine, do it someplace else. We're doing a lot of good stuff in current personality research. Can you please talk about that? So, for example, if we're going to talk about things like, in the personality chapter, things like the Big Five, the Hexaco model, which is sort of Big Five plus, or we talk about Myers-Briggs and why that is not a good test of personality, then we're going to have to take out something else. All right, so for all the psychology faculty, just sit down just for a second. This is going to sound sacrilegious, but I'm going to give you permission to take Freud out of the personality chapter. If you want to talk about Freud, by all means, go ahead and do that, but I would encourage you to do it in the therapy chapter because psychoanalysis is still a thing. So to talk about what psychoanalysis is, how it started with traditional psychoanalysis and Freud's ideas, that's a great place for it. But in the personality chapter, it's that history of personality, not crucial for people to know. You have permission to take it out. Now, at this point, some of your listeners, Bradley, have stopped listening because they will say, yeah, but I love talking about Freud. Okay, yeah, Freud is fun. No doubt about that. But is it really what your neighbors need to know? And is it more important than other stuff that you could be covering in the personality chapter, such as the Hexaco model and why Myers-Briggs is a bad test of personality? Other things do you want to add anything to that, Bradley, before I go on?
I looked at your slides from your APS presentation. One of the things you mentioned, maybe not including, was Zimbardo's prisoner experiment, which I got to say, like, that breaks my heart. It's kind of like some of the stuff I keep in the garage. I know I don't need it. I know it's a little bit debunked. I know it's outdated. It's certainly unethical. It makes me sad, but I get it.
Yeah, so it's probably a little worse than that. I know plenty of people have been teaching the Stanford Prison Study. Okay, from an ethical standpoint, this is why it's pretty awful. And it's also not a well-designed experiment, frankly.
Okay.
I've been calling it the Stanford Prison Study because experiment is a little generous. But it's actually worse than that. So in 2019, a guy by the name of Thibault Letexier published an article in the American Psychologist. It was the October 2019 edition. And anybody who is still teaching the Stanford Prison Study, I'm going to tell you this right now, you are not permitted, like I have any control, right? You are not permitted to teach the Stanford Prison Study again until you read that October 2019 American Psychologist article by Thibault Letexier. It's not a long article. I read the first paragraph, my jaw dropped, and stayed there to the end of the article. So Thibault Letexier is not a psychologist. He's a French filmmaker, lives in Paris. And sometime prior to 2019, he hears about the Stanford Prison Study, which is not well known outside of the United States. So he hears about this and he thinks, well, this would be a fascinating documentary. He goes to a film company. They manage to get some grant money, and Thibault goes to Palo Alto. He goes to Stanford, where all of the boxes of archive materials from the Stanford Prison Study are. And he's going through these materials, and he's just baffled because the story that Zimbardo had been telling for 50 years didn't match the archival record. For example, the guards, the guys who were assigned to be guards, really thought of themselves as research assistants. What the archival materials say is that this study was designed to be a study on prisoner stress. Not on roles, nothing about roles. It was about prisoner stress. So the guards were told their job was to make this experience as stressful for the prisoners as they could. The guy who was the worst guard, John Wayne, he was a drama major at Stanford. He took on that role wholeheartedly, and that's exactly how he saw it, as a role that he was playing. He was a research assistant making this a stressful experience. That's never how Zimbardo talked about it. He always talked about it as they were just randomly assigned these roles, and then this is what happened. So the guards were told, make this a stressful experience. They were told the middle of the night counts, for example. They didn't come up with that on their own. There was one of the guys who was working really as a research assistant, as a consultant. He had spent some time in jail. And he's the one who said, okay, to make this stressful, let's include these middle of the night counts. The guards didn't come up with that. They were told to do it. The prisoners never felt like prisoners. In fact, after the first day, they talked about leaving. And one of them said, well, hold on a second, because we're being paid $15 a day for this. And this was in the 1970s. The equivalent dollar amount now would be about $116 a day. And these guys said, you know, everybody, the reason I signed up for this is for the money. And that hasn't changed because I still need the money. So this was supposed to go for 2 weeks, but they were only going to be paid for the days they were there, not for the entire 2 weeks, even if they left. Which today, ethically, yeah, they'd have to get the whole amount, regardless of how long they stayed. At the time, no, they were just going to be paid for the days that they were there. So they all decided, okay, we're not going to leave. Let's just play along and let's see how long we can make this last. And so they did. And they said, we knew we weren't prisoners. We were in the basement of the psychology building. We could hear upstairs the phones, the copiers. They said people were walking through the basement all the time to see this mock prison. No, it didn't feel like a prison at all. So you've got the guards who are trying to make this a stressful experience. You've got the prisoners who are just, let's play along. We're getting $15 a day. So the interesting thing about this is that even though, and there's much more, please read the article first. The fascinating thing about this is that Zimbardo always talked about this in terms of the roles the prisoners and the guards were playing. And that was the big takeaway. Well, we know from research that there's something called demand characteristics. That if a participant in a study feels like they know what the study is about and they want to help out the researchers, they will change their behavior to make that happen. So in the end, yeah, the study is still about roles, demand characteristics, just not the ones that Zimbardo always told us about. So Letexier, he writes a book actually in French that predated that American Psychologist article. And that book later got translated into English by Letexier and was published just this past fall 2024, by Springer, called Investigating the Stanford Prison Experiment, History of a Lie. Letexier does not pull any punches. And then National Geographic gets a hold of this book, and they do a 3-part documentary called The Stanford Prison Experiment, Unlocking the Truth. So they weren't quite ready to go with the lie language, but unlocking the truth. So that now is available through National Geographic.
I think part of the reason I find myself wanting to hang on to it is because it has portrayed a message about, the dangers of the powers of people in positions of power, similar to the Milgram study, the power of authority. If others feel the same way that I do kind of about that, I assume there is some truth to that message, at least when I look at corporations and politicians and how blindly people follow them sometimes. I go, it seems like a message that everyone ought to hear. And yet it makes me wonder, would it be easier for professors to let go of that study if we could replace it with something? So is there any other research out there on authority that maybe they could talk about instead that might, be more grounded?
Well, all of Milgram's research on authority, I think, is pretty good. He did several studies using the shock machine, and oftentimes we just talk about one, but there were a whole bunch of different conditions that he put people in. Now, having said that, I think you're absolutely right, Bradley. I think that faculty can still talk about the Stanford Prison Study in terms of the power of authority, the power of roles, just as long as it's clear that it's not the roles of prisoner and guard, it's the role of research participant. That you still have all of the norms that are in place and all of the expectations of how you are supposed to behave in a research experiment as you would in a prison environment. That it's just a different role than what Zimbardo had always talked about. So yeah, I think you can still talk about it, but do it first after reading Letexier's American Psychologist article.
Intro Psych spans this huge range of topics, and some of them professors obviously didn't specialize in during their own training, and so they might be tempted to just avoid those topics. Do you have any tips for building competence or confidence in those areas?
Intro Psych is the hardest course to teach because instructors are not expert in all of the content. In fact, we're probably expert in maybe 2 or 3 chapters. When I was putting together one of these talks that you've referenced, I took a look at all the chapters that are typical in an Intro Psych textbook. And I could claim expertise in 3 of them. The welcome to the course. Okay, I can do that. Research methods. I was trained in research methods. I can do that. But even if that wasn't a heavy part of my graduate degree, the research methods that we include in intro, correlations, experiments, basic experimental design, any psychology major would be able to handle that. And then, as you mentioned at the beginning, my master's degree is in social psychology. So I felt like I had a pretty good handle on that. But the rest of the chapters, I didn't have any graduate training in those. I could look back at my undergraduate degree, and I had taken biopsych and lifespan and learning and memory and abnormal psych. And okay, there's a lot there that I didn't remember, but I had a fighting chance. I could read the chapter and oh yeah, okay, that's what that is. But holy cow, Bradley, sensation and perception, consciousness, including sleep, drugs, intelligence, language, emotions, motivation, personality, therapy. No, I had no training in any of that. The only exposure I had to any of that would have been an Intro Psych, which would have been my very first semester as an undergraduate. And we also know that a lot of Intro Psych instructors don't cover all the chapters. They dump some of the chapters. So chances were pretty good that I didn't even have in my Intro Psych class emotions and motivation, intelligence and language. Probably didn't even have consciousness. Not saying that I wasn't conscious during that class. So it's a really hard course to teach. And because of that, so many faculty rely on the textbook to tell them what is important or what should be covered. And good textbook authors consult with experts in those areas to say what should be in here. So yeah, you gotta trust your materials. Now, having said that, I also know that there are plenty of instructors right now who are using open educational resources. They're collecting materials and using it. And that can be sometimes problematic because you're not an expert in all of it. As a textbook author, I am consulting with experts. So if you're doing OER, open educational resources, I encourage you to do the same. Make sure that you are consulting with people who really are experts in those areas to determine what it is that you should include and what you should, just as importantly, exclude.
My last question kind of comes to impact. If professors everywhere adopted these suggestions and reworked their courses so that they reflect the broader and more relevant vision of psychology, how might that reshape students' understanding of the field?
I don't know that it's so much about understanding of the field as it is a recognition of how important psychology is in so many different areas. You know, so I put Lillian Gilbreth in my book, and I was teaching an online psych class the first time I used my book. In that online class, I have a weekly discussion that asks students to do a few different things, one of which is to reflect on something that they read in that chapter for that week that really touched them in some way and to say a little bit about why. And the students, I was just so tickled. I could hardly stand it. She said, I thoroughly enjoyed reading all of this section of the chapter on history. And she said, I like learning about the history of psychology. And I paused right there because I've never had a student say that. I've been teaching this course since the mid-90s, and I have never had a student say, I like learning about the history of psychology. Well, what was in that history were the Clarks, Lillian Gilbreth, and William Marston. William Marston, who we didn't talk about, Bradley, but he was a psychologist who gave us Wonder Woman. And that came out of his interest in truth-telling, lie detection. And you'll notice that one of Wonder Woman's big tools is the lasso of truth. And wouldn't that be awesome if we could just lasso somebody and they have to tell us the truth? So the student reads this, and she said, I like learning about the history of psychology and who played a significant role in shaping the world we live in today. And she said, when I think of psychology, I feel like my mind narrows to only a few select things. So this is a student in her very first week taking Intro Psych. And we know what those narrow things are. We know that she's thinking about psychotherapy and disorders. And she said, beginning to hear about Lillian Gilbreth's story and the others in that section of the chapter opened my eyes to see how much psychology is everywhere in the world. I never would have thought that when I opened my fridge butter that a psychologist invented that, which is pretty neat. And it is pretty neat. And I like to think that every time the student walks into her kitchen, just like I do, and just like you're going to, Bradley, you're going to think about Lillian Gilbreth. And you're going to think about psychology. And wow, if it's having an impact here, where else is it having an impact? And I think that's what the course should really be about, is here is useful information that not only can you use in your life to make your own life better, but to make the lives of others better. And to just appreciate that, yeah, psychology is freaking important.
I love hearing that. And if this direction that you're wanting to take the course in brings more students to say things like that, then it sounds to me like you're on exactly the right track. I just want to thank you so much for having this conversation with us today, and just tell you how much fun it was to kind of revisit these topics that I hadn't thought about in a long time, and then hear about some new ones. So just thank you so much.
Thank you, Bradley. I really appreciated the opportunity.
Thanks for listening to another episode of Psych Everywhere. If you haven't already subscribed to Psych Everywhere, go ahead and follow us wherever you go for podcasts. Tell a friend or a colleague about the show. Word of mouth is a huge help, so share what you learned at the dinner table or in your classes. You can also follow us on X at PsychI Podcast and leave a review at Apple Podcasts. You'll absolutely make my day, and more importantly, you'll be helping us to get Psych everywhere. Okay, that's all for now. I'll connect with you again soon. Copyright 2025, PsychI, the International Honor Society in Psychology. All rights reserved.